In remembrance, the victims. The people who died in the Heppner Flood should be remembered not only for how they died, but also for who they were. For some, that will never be possible, yet the sketches assembled here convey what can be learned from the Morrow County Museum's flood and family files, probate records in the Morrow County Courthouse, U.S. Census reports, genealogy sources, newspaper stories, letters, the Heppner website, W.S. Schiach's Illustrated History of Umatilla and Morrow Counties, and the Morrow County Historical Society's 1983 History of Morrow County. I had vital genealogical research assistance from Sarah Little in Seattle, Virginia Roberts in Pendleton, and Cindy Breidenbach in Heppner. One section below describes what we can learn of the flood's Chinese victims. Another looks at the people in Lexington and Ione who died of typhoid months after the flood because their wells were contaminated by the floodwaters. Abraham sick. Antone, Herminia, and their daughter, Margaret. Both Antone, a tailor, and Herminia were born in Germany. He was 66, she was 53. Their 22-year-old daughter was born in California, and on the afternoon of June 14th was at home with Herminia. Luckily, 16-year-old Johanna and Antone Jr., almost 15, were away. Herminia had two other survivors, Elsie Myers and William Berger, apparently children from an earlier marriage. Initially, there was hope for Antone, who was injured when the flood swept into his tailor's shop about 6 blocks from their home, but he died during the night. Adkins, Nora Beatrice. Nora was 18, the second of the 10 children of Frank Adkins and Maddie Dennis Adkins. Frank was pastor of Methodist Episcopal Church South, and Nora may have been the organist. She was born on the family ranch on Rhea Creek, October 8, 1884. Nora was at the church that Sunday afternoon, likely helping the children practice their evening program. Alba Bartholomew kept the youngsters inside the church after their rehearsal, but apparently Nora went out in the storm. She may have been caught by the floodwaters a block or so north, but the Portland Oregonian said she sought shelter with a relative, likely the home of C.A. and Leonora Rea, about 2 blocks northeast of the church. C.A.'s late wife, Sophronia Adkins Rea, was Nora's aunt, Frank Adkins' sister. The house at the corner of Chase and May was right in the path of the flood. See Rea. Andrews, Ida and their daughters, Mabel, Vashti, and Annie Claire. Ida was 30, born in Athena, Oregon, the daughter of George and Mildred Swaggart. Mabel, almost 12, Vashti 10, and 4-year-old Annie Claire were all born in Heppner, where Ida and Clarence L. Andrews were married September 8, 1889. Clarence was the first clerk of Morrow County. The family moved to Portland soon after Annie was born, when Clarence took a customs service job there. Ida and their daughters later moved with Clarence to Skagway, Alaska, when he was transferred there. The Heppner Gazette of July 23, 1903, published a resolution of condolence from the Magpie Club of Skagway, mourning the loss of our most beloved member, Ida B. Andrews. 3 months before the flood, Ida and the girls returned to Heppner. It appears Ida and Clarence had separated. Ida, Mabel, Vashti, and Annie were spending June 14th with Ida's sister, Eva Beard, and her sons in the Swaggarts' Chase Street home. Mildred Swaggart had left by train the day before to see relatives in Trenton, Missouri. Ida's body was the last one found in the summer of 1903, and she was buried in Heppner Masonic Cemetery beside her children, Iva, and Iva's sons. See Beard. Ashbaugh. Up in the Heppner Masonic Cemetery, the Ashbaugh family stone is so crowded with names there's nothing more to say. Cora May, wife of E.C. Ashbaugh. Iva Dell, born June 5, 1892. Irma Leola, born March 8, 1894. Mary Viola, born October 14, 1895. Gilbert Stanton, born July 21, 1897. Cecil Fay, born April 14, 1899. Gladys Pearl, born March 18, 1901. Mildred May, born May 9, 1903, died June 14, 1903. Children of E.C. and C.M. Ashbaugh. Cora May was almost 31, born July 8, 1872 in Iowa to Elihu B. and Mary Stanton. She and Ed were married January 31, 1891. Ed had done well raising wheat near 8 Mile, and they moved into Heppner the year before the flood when he became county commissioner. On June 14th, Ed was in Portland on county business. See Jones, Kelly, Leffler. Ashbaugh, Kenneth. This was the 6-week-old son of Moses and Mary Jones Ashbaugh. Moses and Mary were in the proprietor's quarters behind the Heppner Hotel on June 14th. Kenneth's nearly blind mother held him and her nephew in her arms as the flood struck their cottage. The babies were swept away, but she chanced to rescue Everett Jones and reared him as her own. See Jones, Kelly, Leffler. Austin, Arthur. Thought to be a sheep shearer from Dolph, Oregon, he was presumed a victim because he was registered at the Heppner Hotel and his trunk was not claimed. Ayers, John Luther. Born in Iowa, October 19, 1860. Johnny Ayers was 2 years old when he crossed the plains in a wagon train with his parents William and Matilda Ayers and his uncle T.W. Ayers and Tom's family. Johnny also raised sheep on Little Butter Creek northeast of Heppner. After he and Mary Ellen Hale Ayers had children, they moved into Heppner to the row of Ayers homes on Willow Creek. Friends and family recalled many happy hours at the Ayers home where Mary Ellen would play the organ or piano and John would lead them in singing. Their home was always open to friends and strangers alike. Johnny and Buell McSwords were visiting George and Lily Conser Sunday afternoon, and when the storm threatened, Johnny insisted on hurrying home. He, Buell, and the Conser's servant George Kawahara ran from the house and perished. If John had been at home 2 blocks south, he would have lived. Only the porch was damaged. He left 3 teenage children, Mabel, Ella, and Gussie, Jack. Mary Ellen, ill since 1902, died about 3 years after the flood. Ayers, Bessie, Winnie, and Lyndon. These were the children of William M. Ayers and Anna Billy Ayers, the grandchildren of Alfred Ayers and great-grandchildren of William Ayers. The headstone of Bessie Francis, almost 11, mourns, "How desolate our home, bereft of thee." The stone of Winnie Zadell Ayers, about 2 weeks short of 7 years old, declares, "She was the sunshine of our home." The sentiment for Lyndon Thomas, who would have been 5 on July 2nd. "How much of light, how much of joy is buried with our darling boy." Their brother, Charles, survived by crawling into a car at the train yard. Their father rode the limbs of a tree to safety, and their mother was thrown into a cherry tree that withstood the water. Banks, Clay Leon and Eliza. They had moved to Heppner after being wed in their hometown, Milton, Oregon, 1 month before the flood. The East Oregonian for June 26, 1903, reported that a service had been held for them in the new Milton Opera House on June 21st. The August 7th East Oregonian said they moved to Heppner because CL had secured a position in one of the stores. Byrd, Iva and her sons, James and Wilbur. Ivy was the 24-year-old daughter of George and Mildred Swaggart. She and Robert L. Byrd had been married in Heppner September 17, 1897. James was almost 3, Wilbur 13 months. They were spending the Sunday afternoon with Iva's sister, Ida Andrews, and her 3 daughters at their parents' home. Robert Byrd was in Portland. See Andrews. Bailey, William. This 73-year-old man drove freight teams into the John Day country southeast of Heppner. He moved to Morrow County 20 years before the flood. Berg, Patrick and his wife. Patrick Berg is believed to have been a sheep shearer staying at the Heppner Hotel, while his wife worked there as a cook's assistant. Both were presumed lost. Boyd, Emma and her daughters, Helen, Emma Leonora, and an infant. Emma, 37, was born in Eugene, Oregon, the daughter of James R. and Elizabeth Phillips. She married O. Guy Boyd, December 29, 1897. Helen was 4 years old, and Emma Leonora was 2.5. Baby Boyd was born March 23, 1903. The funeral notice in the Arlington Methodist Episcopal Church said Emma and her infant were found together. Emma was the sister of Hattie Kinsley, a flood victim who died with her husband, George. Guy Boyd and George Kinsley were partners in Liberty Meat Market in Heppner. Emma and her daughters are buried in Arlington. See Kinsley. Boyer, Charles and his wife, of Garnett, Kansas. These visitors had arrived the morning of the flood and registered at the Heppner Hotel. No further information could be found, but their bodies were identified, so they may have had family in Morrow County. Brady, J.W., thought to be the young son of Thomas and Maggie Brady. He is buried in Heppner Masonic Cemetery. Briggs, Eunice Ruth. This 16-year-old daughter of Hannah French Briggs and Leon W. Briggs, bookkeeper of Gilliam and Bisbee, had 2 siblings, Opal and Julius. She was the cousin of Florence French, flood victim, and daughter of Marquis de Lafayette French. Eunice and Florence were apparently at the family ranch on Hinton Creek. Their aunt, Luella French Gurdain, died at her home in Heppner. See French Gurdain. Bullis, Otis. Born in 1880, this 23-year-old from Tower City, North Dakota, was said to be on a cattle drive. He was registered at the Heppner Hotel and presumed lost. Carr, Lilius. The 15-month-old daughter of J.K. and Ella Carr is memorialized in a stained glass window behind the altar in All Saints Memorial Episcopal Church at Galen Church in Heppner. Lilius was born February 26, 1902, the 5th of the Carr children. Her older sister had taken Lilius to the home of Marcus and Elizabeth Gunn on Sunday afternoon, and the toddler was with the Gunns when the flood struck their home. See Gunn. Chambers, Charles. He is thought to have been a sheep herder or sheep shearer, probably staying at the Heppner Hotel. His luggage was found and never claimed, so he was presumed dead. Church, Mariah and William. Mariah Church, also known as Mariah Gray, was the mother or wife of William Church and had a 30-year-old daughter, Lucy Jackson, whose husband, E.S. Jackson, was administrator of her estate. 5 years after the flood, Mariah's heirs proved up on her homestead near Rhea Creek, south of Heppner. Connor, John. This man was 40 years old and a resident of Meacham. He was buried in the cemetery there. Curtis, Ada Rhea Curtis, her daughter Lori, and unborn child. Ada, 28, was the daughter of Columbus A. Rhea, Loom, and the late Sophronia Atkins Rhea. Ada and Charles H. Curtis would have observed their 7th wedding anniversary the day after the flood. Lori was 3, and Ada was expecting their 2nd child. On Sunday, it appears Ada and Lori were visiting at her father's home at Chase and May with Leonora Rea and her daughter, Loie, and Ada's cousin, Nora Adkins. Ada's sister, Lily Conser, barely escaped when she and George were carried across the flood in their attic. See Adkins Rea. Davis, George. This man was apparently a visitor. Only his trunk was found after the flood. He is buried in Heppner. Dawson, Jacob R., and his wife, Melvina A. Jacob, 63, was a farmer near the Dalles in Wasco County in 1900. Melvina, 61, was identified in the bank ledger list of flood victims as Mrs. Dawson of the Fair. Both Jacob and Melvina may have worked at the Fair, the department store owned by A.C. Geiger, who had owned another store in the chain, the New York Cash Store in the Dalles. The Dawsons had been married about 42 years, living in Kansas before moving to Oregon. They died when their large home at Maine and Baltimore was swept away. That house had been the scene 6 months earlier of the newsworthy wedding of their daughter, Melvia and Olney B. Funk of Spokane. Jacob and Melvina left 4 adult children. Dawson, Percy E., his wife, Ella LaForge Dawson, and their infant. 30-year-old Percy had been born in England and still had family there in June 1903. Apparently, he was not related to Jacob R. Dawson. Ella, 19, had been born in Montana, and they were married almost 3 years before the flood. The 1903 Morrow County jury pool lists Percy as a laborer. Apparently, all 3 died in their home on Willow Creek. Dennis, J.H. Earl, and his son Carl. 54-year-old Joseph H. Earl Dennis was a widowed farmer renting land in Robertson County, Tennessee, when he and his 11-year-old son Carl apparently came to Morrow County to visit Earl's oldest son, William O. Dennis, who was growing hay near Pine City, northeast of Heppner. Earl's wife, Celeste, died before Carl was 8 years old. Census records for 1900 say Earl was responsible for Carl, Carl's 16-year-old sister, Viola, and the 3-year-old daughter of Earl's older granddaughter, Sini, who had died between 1896 and 1899. After Earl and Carl were killed in the flood, the 6-year-old granddaughter, Maud Eldridge, became a ward of the state and was reared by an elderly couple in Tennessee. Elder, Sarah. This woman was 88 years old, a native of Canada, and the mother of 2 sons and 1 daughter. Born Sarah Rouse, she married Alexander Elder, a native of England, and after John N. Elder was born in Toronto, they moved first to Iowa and then to Illinois, where Alonzo and Josephine were born. Alexander Elder died before Sarah. Alonzo and Josephine moved to Oregon in time for the 1870 census. They lived with John, his wife Lucinda, and their growing family in Heppner. Sarah's son, John, an apparently successful stock raiser, died in Heppner June 15, 1889. At the time of the flood, Alonzo was 55 and Josephine 54, and the Elders lived in a large home at the corner of Main and Center across from the fair. Elliot, Maud. This woman from Walla Walla, Washington, was the nurse for Thomas Harriman of Long Creek, the consumption patient camping for his health on the lawn of his doctor on Willow Creek. She died with Tom, his son Frank, and Frank's wife Myrtle. Probably Maud was the sister, perhaps the mother, of Myrtle Elliott Harriman. See Harriman. Estes, Lois. This was the 7-year-old daughter of Leonora Estes Rea and her first husband, physician Logan Estes, who died in February 1899. Loie, who had been born January 14, 1896, was with her mother on June 14th. See Curtis, Rea. Estes, Rosaltha Sylvester and her daughter Blanche. Rose was 53, her daughter 16. Rose and her husband William had been married 28 years and had another daughter, Fern, 14, and a 10-year-old son, Mark, still at home. Rose operated a restaurant in a wooden building on the east side of Main Street. It is not known if she and Blanche died there or in their home. William, a blacksmith, moved to Boise, Idaho after the flood and died in March 1911. He is buried beside his wife and daughter in Heppner. Farmer, S.C. This man farmed in Black Horse Canyon near Lexington. His primary heirs were a 51-year-old sister in Indiana and a nephew and niece, ages 17 and 15. The teenagers may have been living with Farmer since their custody was an issue in his probate proceedings. Fisher, William A. This 74-year-old farmer who had a fine orchard near Haystack probably died in the Heppner Hotel where he had been staying for several weeks while receiving medical treatment. Florian, Eleanor. One of the first victims of the Heppner Flood, Nora was the 22-year-old daughter of Sylvester W. and Mary Martin Florian. Her mother had emigrated from Germany, her father known as Butcher Bill from France. Nora and 7 siblings were born in Hanover, Kansas. 3 of the children died of diphtheria in Kansas before the family moved to Morrow County. At the time she died, Nora had 2 sisters, Mary and Viola, and 1 brother, Ralph. Viola and Ralph also died young, so when their mother, Mary, died in 1934, she had outlived 7 of her 8 children. Nora died at Balm Fork. She was said to be house-sitting one of the Florian family ranches there. She may also have been with Harry and Emma Hanby to help with their newborn, or going for the doctor when the Hanby baby decided to arrive during the storm. See Hanby, Kirk. Ford, Gertrude. The Boys and Girls Aid Society in Portland had placed this child with Eliza Willis in Heppner. She is buried in Heppner. See Willis. French, Florence. This 23-year-old daughter of Marquis de Lafayette French came to Oregon with her father in 1891 after Florence's mother, Nancy Porter, and her brother had both died in the Midwest. Florence was the cousin of flood victim Eunice Briggs, whose mother, Hannah, was MDL French's sister. Florence and Eunice apparently were at the family ranch on Hinton Creek. Their aunt, Luella French Gurdain, died in Heppner. See Briggs, Gurdain. Frey. E.C. Frey, a farmer near Black Horse Canyon, 2 miles south of Lexington, had lost his wife, Lida, on February 22, 1902. He and his daughter Margaret, a student at Oregon Architectural College in Corvallis, had taken out an ad in the March 6, 1902 Gazette thanking their friends and neighbors who were so kind to assist them during the illness and death of their wife and mother. After the flood, Margaret returned to Morrow County the grant her family had received from the Heppner Flood Relief Committee. Fristow, Bertha. She was 17 years old, the youngest of 4 children of James A. and Hattie Fristow. Her father had homesteaded land just west of Heppner. We know little about Bertha, but guess she and Nora Adkins, also a victim, were friends. 2 weeks before the flood, on June 1st, they were witnesses for the wedding of Arthur Dykstra and Ida White. Geiger, Alvin C., described by the Gazette July 2, 1903 as a good, true man. A.C. owned the Fair Department Store in Heppner. After several years in banking, he had started the New York Cash Store in the Dalles, Oregon, selling it and moving to Heppner 4 years before the flood. He was 37, the son of German parents B.H. and Sarah Geiger. He and Lily Spaulding had been married in Kansas in 1891 and had 2 children, Roscoe and Charlotte. W.S. Schiach wrote about him, "His strict adherence to upright business principles and uncompromising integrity have won for him a large and increasing patronage, which is fully merited." Lily and the children had gone east to visit family when school let out for the summer. The Geigers were renting the home of Dr. Buell McSwords on Chase Street. We assume A.C. Geiger was at home June 14th. He was buried in Atchison, Kansas. Gordon, J.C. This man was presumed dead. His trunk was never claimed. Gove, H. This man was staying at the Heppner Hotel and did not return for his trunk. Gromes, T.C. A sheep shearer from Carbondale, Colorado. Gromes did not come back to claim his trunk. Gunn, Alexander Marcus and his wife Elizabeth. Marcus was born 52, born in London, Ontario, Canada. Libby, 45, was the oldest daughter of Detroit physician Dr. E.R. Ellis. They had 4 children, Mary, 14, Isabella, 12, Marcus, 9, and Gertrude, 7. They lived in Chicago before moving to Heppner. A memorial service was held there in the church where Marcus and Libby were members, and the children had been christened. Marcus was a blacksmith and rancher, and in 1902 had built a new house for the family on 2 lots at the corner of Main and Church Streets. On June 14th, Gertrude was at the Methodist Episcopal Church South on Chase Street, practicing for the children's program. Bella was with the Jonas family just outside of town. A daughter of J.K. and Ella Carr came to visit with her baby sister, Lilius, but went on to see another friend, leaving the toddler with the Gunns. Marcus and Libby Gunn died along with Lilius. Mary and young Marcus somehow made it the 3 blocks to the West Hill. The parents are buried in Heppner Masonic Cemetery. Their mother's family apparently reared the 4 children in Detroit. See Carr. Gerdane, Luella. She had turned 43 2 days before the flood. Ella and Douglas Gerdane were married October 6, 1886 in the Methodist Episcopal Church South in Heppner and had 1 child, Buell. Doug was Heppner Town Marshal. They lived on Willow Creek next door to her brother, Marquis de Lafayette French, and his daughter Florence. Doug, who died in 1936, is buried next to Luella in Heppner. The flood also took 2 of her nieces, Florence French and Eunice Briggs. See Briggs French. Haynes, Clara and her daughter Hazel. Clara Junkins Haynes was 29. Hazel was soon to be 11. Their husband and father was M.B. Haynes, chef at the Palace Hotel. Hamilton, Lillian E. and her daughters Bertha, Vida, and Clara. Lily was 38, Bertha was 17, Clara 12, and Vida's age is unknown. David A. Hamilton, Lily's husband and the girl's father, had committed suicide, apparently despondent over failing health, 14 months before the flood. Now there were just the 2 sons, George, 21, and Frank, 19, whom the Heppner Flood Relief Committee reported were self-supporting. Hanby, Harry, Emma, and their newborn. Harry, 26, and his wife Emma Voos Hanby, 22, lived in a canyon just off Balm Fork, about 5 miles south of Heppner, where Harry raised horses and cattle. His mother, Melissa Hanby Kirk, 50, was there to help with their new baby. It is probable that these were the first victims of the Heppner Flood. See Florian Kirk. Harris. J.J. Harris was in town as a salesman representing a soap and perfume company. He perished in the Heppner Hotel. Harris, John J., a tinsmith for Gilliam and Bisbee, who lived at the home of Julius and Amanda Keithley. Harris was 41 and a charter member of the Elks Lodge in Heppner. He was helping prepare supper when the floodwaters struck the Keithley house. According to the Gazette for August 13, 1903, Harris was remembered at a service in his hometown, Wrightsville, Pennsylvania. See Keithley, Wyland. Harriman, Thomas B., his son, J. Franklin, and Frank's wife, Myrtle. Thomas Benton Harriman, 52, was born in Missouri. He and his wife, Mary, moved to Oregon in about 1880 and ranched near Long Creek, about 47 miles south of Heppner. They had buried 4 children. Tom and Mary's son, Frank, was 26, his wife, Myrtle, 22. They had been married in Long Creek October 14, 1899, and their son, Stuart, would be 3 in November. Todd had consumption and was taking the fresh air treatment, camping on the edge of Willow Creek in the yard of his physician, A.K. Higgs. Though Frank and Myrtle accompanied Tom in Heppner, we assume their Stuart had stayed in Long Creek because he lived until 1992 and is buried between Frank and Myrtle in Heppner Masonic Cemetery. Maud Elliott, probably Myrtle's sister and believed to be living in Walla Walla, was acting as Tom's nurse and also died June 14th. See Elliott. Hart, Eudora. Eudora Grounds Hart was 65 and lived with her husband Ransom on their Balm Fork Ranch about a mile southeast of Heppner. They had settled there in 1873 after traveling by wagon from Arkansas, first with oxen and mule teams and then with horses Ransom broke on the way. Eudora was born and reared in Missouri. They had 9 children. On June 14th, Eudora was in the kitchen, which was torn from the house. Eudora's daughter, Amy Day, wrote, "The kitchen lodged on a bluff in front of the house and below. The wood box was full of wood, and the cupboard had the dishes in, and not a thing was broken. A pie that was in the lower part was dry and whole." Eudora was the mother of Samantha Hart Stalter, who died with 6 of her 7 children in the flood. See Stalter. Creek, where 3 of their children were working on June 14th. Rebecca was 48, Mary 25, Nellie 15, and Mabel 11. Rebecca's brother, James Long, also died in the flood with his wife, Mina, and 3 of their children. See Long. Huggins, Fred. This man was registered at the Heppner Hotel and presumed dead. Hind, Izoria, Zoe Hind, and her children, Jean Lucille and Bert. Zoe was 27, born in Butte, Montana, and on March 15, 1899, married Robert F. Hind, a native of Scotland and the first of his large sheep-raising family to come to Morrow County. Zoe was the sister of photographer Bert Sigsbee, who had arrived not long before the flood and purchased Mike Galloway's photography business. Zoe taught school for a time in Heppner. Jean Lucille was 3.5, James Gilbert was 18 months, and Zoe was pregnant. Robert was general manager of the Morrow County Land and Trust Company and also raised his own sheep. His sister, Eliza Barrett, and her family probably would have died when Zoe and the children did, but left hours before the flood to spend the summer at their Sand Hollow Ranch. On June 14th, the Hines' house at the north end of Heppner was ripped apart, and Robert, carried away on the stairway landing, was saved by Wallace Lipset. See Lipset. Jenkins. John and Lily, their daughter Zella, and a granddaughter, Hazel Mallory. John Jenkins, 55, operated a brickyard and kiln on Hinton Creek and raised wheat 14 miles southwest of Heppner. He and Lily Bidwell, 46, were married in about 1871 and had 6 children, one of whom died in 1891. Their youngest, Zella V., 10, was still at home. On June 14th, Hazel, the daughter of Hattie Jenkins Mallory, was visiting. probably in the Jenkins home near the confluence of Hinton and Willow Creek. See Mallory. Jones, James and Delitha Jones, their daughters Elsa Jones and Amanda Kimsey, granddaughter Elizabeth Kimsey, and Amanda's unborn child. James and Delitha, both 65, had 10 children, but had lost 3. For 30 years, they raised horses and cattle and operated a dairy 2 miles south of Heppner on Willow Creek. James and Delitha had sold that ranch and were living temporarily in a house a mile closer to Heppner, waiting to move to Okanagan, Washington. James Jones and his sons had moved their livestock to Washington, and James had returned for the family, but they were delayed because Delitha was sick. Waiting with the parents on June 14th were Elsa Jones, 26, Amanda Jones Kimsey, 44, and Amanda's 3-year-old Elizabeth. Mandy was pregnant. See Kimsey. Jones, L. Pearl and May, and 3 of their children, Leiter, Zelma, and Amy. Lemuel Pearl, 34, and Laura May Ashbaugh Jones, 25, grew up on neighboring wheat ranches near 8 Mile and had married 10 years before the flood. They were one couple of a family consolidation in which 4 Jones siblings married 4 Ashbaugh siblings. May's brother, Edward C. Ashbaugh, married a woman from a different family. May and Pearl had 5 children, Vance, 9, Amy, 8, Leiter, 6, Zelma, 3, and Everett, 14 months. They had lived and worked at Jordan, 3 miles south of Ione, until fire took their home and mercantile business just more than 2 years before the flood. In early 1903, Pearl and May became partners with Moses Ashbaugh and Mary Jones Ashbaugh, operating the Heppner Hotel on North Main Street. On June 14th, Pearl and May were the proprietors on duty with their children at the hotel. Vance was playing outside and heard a horseman's warning. Everett was staying with Moses and Mary and was saved by his Aunt Mary. See Ashbaugh. Kawahara, George. This 22-year-old native of Japan was a servant in the home of George and Lily Conser. He ran from the Conser home with John Ayers and Buell McSwords, and all 3 were swept to their deaths. George is buried in Heppner Masonic Cemetery. Keithley, Amanda. Amanda Maud Keithley was 60, born in Indiana in 1842, and married since April 3, 1884, to Julius Keithley, former Morrow County judge and former county assessor. Also lost with the Keithley home at Chase and Willow Streets were the Keithley's grandson, James Stewart Weiland, and a boarder, John J. Harris. Julius survived to tell a dramatic story of his attempts to save Amanda in the swirling floodwaters. Amanda also was survived by 2 grown daughters and 2 adult sons from earlier marriage. See Harris, Weiland. Kelly, Ora A. This 8-year-old was the grandson of Susan R. Leffler and second cousin of Edward C. Ashbaugh. He had been born in Esben, Kansas in July 1894. His parents, Mary Leffler Kelly and Thomas D. Kelly, lived in Umatilla at the time of the flood. Probably he was visiting his grandmother. See Ashbaugh, Jones L. Pearl, and May Leffler. Kernan, James M. and his wife Mary. James was the Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company agent in Heppner. He and his wife and children lived upstairs in the depot at the north end of Heppner. James had been stationed with the railroad in La Grande, Oregon, before moving to Heppner. Both were 41, the children of Irish immigrants. He was born in Indiana, she in Minnesota. On Sunday afternoon, their children, Charles, 17, Frank, 15, and Katie, 14, were led up the hill behind the depot by James's assistant, Fred Hart. James and Mary died trying to run from the depot to the same hill. The June 26th East Oregonian reported that the entire city of La Grande had attended their memorial service June 25th. The paper reported the Kernan children would move to Northfield, Minnesota, to live with Mary Kernan's sister. Kimsey, Amanda, her daughter Elizabeth, and Amanda's unborn child. Mandy was 44, born in Iowa, and living with her parents, James and Delitha Jones, since she and her husband, Thomas, had separated. Elizabeth was 3. Mother and children may have been going to move with James and Delitha to Okanagan, Washington, as soon as Delitha was well enough to travel. See Jones, James and Delitha. Kinsley, George P. and Hattie. Born February 14, 1869 in Iowa, he was 34. She was 38, born November 16, 1864 in Rock Creek near Arlington, Oregon, where her parents still live June 14, 1903. George Kinsley and Guy Boyd, married to sisters Hattie and Emma Phillips, were partners in the Liberty Meat Market in Heppner. George and Hattie had been married just over 2 years, having wed in February 1901. They are buried near Emma and her children in Arlington Cemetery. See Boyd. Kirk, Melissa. Lissy Kirk was the mother of Harry Hanby, who also died with his wife Emma and new baby when the floodwaters first turned deadly. Melissa Walsh Hanby Kirk would have been 50 in September. She and her first husband, Benjamin Hanby, had 6 children. 1 died in infancy of diphtheria. Benjamin died in his early 30s in 1883 when Harry was 11 years old. In 1884, Melissa married Jesse James Kirk, a stockman who had made a name for himself as a child by driving 3 yokes of oxen from Missouri to the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Melissa and Jesse had 4 children. On June 14th, Melissa is believed to have been at the Hanby home to help with the new baby. She was survived by her husband and 8 children, the youngest 6 years old. See Hanby. Krug, Frederick, his wife, Emma M., and their 5 children, Mary, Emma, Fred Jr., George, and an infant. Both 34-year-old Fred and his 33-year-old wife, sometimes called Anna or Mary Anna, were born in Kratska, Russia. Their oldest daughter, Mary May, was born in Russia in 1891, and the next daughter, Emma, was born in Oregon in 1896. So they must have immigrated between 1891 and 1896. The others in the family quarters on June 14th were Fred Krug Jr., 6, George, 3, and an infant whose name and age we don't know. Their survivors included Anna's sister in the United States and Fred's siblings in St. Petersburg, Russia. It's not clear whether the family quarters was built over Willow Creek at the south end of Heppner or stood on the bank while their adjoining Heppner steam laundry extended over the creek. Either way, the family was directly in the path of the flood. Leffler, Susan and her daughter Maud. Susan Leffler was 64, her daughter 24. These women were the aunt and cousin of brothers Edward C. and Moses Ashbaugh, Susan being the sister of their mother, Mary Rudisill Ashbaugh of 8 Mile. Susan Rudisill was born in Pennsylvania in August 1838 and married Jacob A. Leffler in 1863 in Perry County, Ohio. They had 14 children, but only 3 lived to adulthood. Jacob, a farmer, died between 1900 and 1902 in Esben, Kansas, where the family had lived since about 1873. Presumably, Susan and Maud had come to Morrow County because Mary Ashbaugh and her family lived there. By June 1903, Susan's daughter, Mary Leffler Kelly, and her family had moved from Kansas to Umatilla, Oregon. Mary Kelly's son, Ora, also died in the flood. See Ashbaugh Kelly. Lipset, W. Wallace, his wife Ada, and their daughter Florinda. Theirs is the tallest stone in Heppner Masonic Cemetery, fitting for one of the flood's heroes. Wallace, 31, and his wife, Ada Farnsworth Lipset, 28, had moved to Heppner from San Jose, California 2 years before the flood, about a year after they were married in San Francisco. Their only child, Florinda, was 14 months old. Wallace was head bookkeeper at the Morrow County Land and Trust Company, of which O.E. Farnsworth, Ada's uncle, was president. The San Jose newspaper said Wallace grew up in California, attended business college, and worked aboard the steamer Albatross before they married and moved to Heppner. On June 14th, the Lipset home, across Gale from the Methodist Episcopal Church, had been swept up and Ada and Florinda carried away. Wallace initially made it to safety, but while rescuing his boss, Robert Hind, from the wooden platform that carried him across the flood, Wallace was sucked under the swirling water. Long, James and Mina and their children, Clara, Annie, and Ray. The family had spent most of the previous 15 years on a homestead in the mountains and had unknowingly moved into danger 6 months earlier when they bought lots in North Heppner and began building a home there. James H., 40, was a wood chopper, and their mountain acreage had provided a rich supply of material. James and Mina, 30, had a large family, though it is not clear how large. Morrow County Cemetery records say they had buried 3 youngsters on their acreage near Freezeout Ridge. 6 children were with James and Mina on June 14th. Ray was 13, Annie 6, and Clara 4. 3 survivors, Minnie 12, Addie 10, and Charles 8, were reared by their parents' brothers and sisters, with Hadley Barker, husband of James Long's sister Eva, as their guardian. James's life insurance with the Woodmen of the World Lodge likely helped. James had joined the lodge 2 days before the flood. Mina was a member of the lodge's sister group, Women of the Woodcraft. James's sister, Rebecca Howard, also died with her spouse and 3 children. A girl named Amy Long was adopted by a Morrow County family in 1903. Birth records in Yakima, Washington say James and Mina had a baby there in August 1901, presumably while they were visiting Mina's family near Yakima. That baby may have been Amy. See Howard. Looney Preston, a 73-year-old stock raiser. Press was born in Tennessee in October 1830. He married Margaret Conley in 1885, but the 1900 census listed him as a widower. When he was 24, he was searching for gold around Mount Jefferson, about 125 miles west of Heppner in the Oregon Cascades. Press apparently invested in real estate. He lived in North Heppner in what was designated beginning in 1884 as Looney's Addition. Mallory, Hazel. At 9 years old, Hazel Grace was the oldest daughter of Hattie Jenkins Mallory and Charles P. Mallory. Her paternal grandfather, Augustus Mallory, was a pioneer, Morrow County judge, postmaster, and U.S. Circuit Court commissioner. On June 14th, Hazel was visiting her maternal grandparents, John and Lily Jenkins, and their youngest daughter, Hazel's 10-year-old aunt, Zella Jenkins. The flood took them all, John, Lily, Zella, and Hazel. C. Jenkins. Matlock, James W. A week before his 61st birthday, James had been married for 40 years to Anna Cooper. They had 8 children. James Matlock was one of 7 sons and 1 daughter born to Edward Matlock and Mary Fry Matlock in Tennessee and Missouri before they crossed the plains to Oregon by ox team. When Edward died at age 46 in 1863, Mary and the children moved from Lane County to Morrow County. James's oldest brother was then 26, James was 15. When he was 27, James was elected Morrow County Treasurer and later was deputy sheriff under his older brother, Edward L. Matlock, Jr. After Edward Jr. died, James was elected sheriff in 1900. James also farmed. James and Anna lived on Chase Street next door to his brother, Thomas J., and Tom's wife, Mary. James and Tom's brother, William F. Matlock, was the longtime mayor of Pendleton, Oregon, and a designated leader of the Heppner recovery. Their nephew, Leslie Matlock, Edward's son, rode with Bruce Kelly to warn people in Lexington and Ione. When the flood struck their home June 14th, James Matlock had been unable to get upstairs. His youngest son, Lee, reported that when James tried the side porch, he was swept away. Lee held on inside the house as it was carried 200 yards and then sunk. He climbed on some wreckage and floated another mile downstream, then swam ashore. Matlock, Mary Elizabeth, the wife of Thomas J. Matlock and sister-in-law of flood victim James Matlock, Mary Elizabeth Keeney Larkins, 54, had married Tom Matlock 32 years earlier. They had 6 children and 4 were still at home for the 1900 census. On June 14, 1903, it's possible daughters Nora, 18, and Marissa, 14, were living there. Tom Matlock raised sheep and racehorses and built and operated a racetrack 5 miles up Hinton Creek until the death of their 21-year-old son, James, in 1894. On June 14th, the flood tore their house apart, separating Tom and Mary. Knowing Mary was lost, Tom worked to save himself. The waves were like the waves of the ocean and were crowded with all kinds and conditions of drift. Floating with him were dogs and cattle, whole houses and parts of houses wrenched asunder, and here and there a human being. He managed to crawl under the water and the mass and at last reached the surface. He was bruised from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. McBride, Samuel N., his wife Hannah, their daughters Anna and Alma, and sons Ralph and Wilfred. McBride, 52, was a farmer and wagon maker. His wife, Hannah Barnes McBride, was 48. Both were born in Canada, as were Anna, Alma, and Ralph, so the family moved from Canada to Oregon between 1890, when Ralph was born in Canada, and 1896, when Wilfred was born in Oregon. Anna was 22, Alma 15, Ralph 13, and Wilfred 7. We know more about Anna because she was the best friend of Gertrude Crawford Parker, who wrote to a McBride relative about Anna after the flood. Hannah McBride also wrote a revealing letter to her sister in Marlette, Michigan on December 19, 1902. Our silver anniversary comes in February. We have sold our farm, so we will spend no more summers there. I am glad, for I do not like living in the country very well, and Sam says he can do better at his trade than farming. 3 sons were left of the 9 McBrides. J. Walter, 24, was in the mountains tending Ed Day's sheep. Fred, 21, and Harold, 18, were also away. McCleary, Charles, perhaps McClary. This is a child buried in Heppner Masonic Cemetery. McDowell, Zetta Hazel. This girl was living with her mother in the Court Street home of 70-year-old William Barton, her maternal grandfather at the time of the 1900 census, and probably on June 14, 1903. Minnie McDowell and her daughter Zetta had also lived in Lexington. Zetta was born December 4, 1895 in Oregon, and so was 7 years old on June 14th when she saw the onrush and ran directly into it, crying out to her mother to run. Her mother got to the window in time to see Zetta carried away, unable to render assistance. McSwords, P. Buell. A physician, he had been practicing in Heppner about 21 years after graduating from Dartmouth Medical School and working in Bellevue Hospital in New York and in China and Germany. Buell was 46. His wife Sybil and his daughter Mary had returned to Massachusetts so Mary could attend school there. She was to graduate from Quincy High School in the month of the flood. When Sybil and Mary moved east, Buell rented their Chase Street home to A.C. and Lily Geiger and the Geiger children. On June 14th, Buell and John Ayers were visiting George and Lily Conser, and when the storm got frightful, they ran outside. Buell, Johnny, and the Conser servant George Kawahara were swept to their deaths. Alban Geiger must have died about the same time the McSword's house was demolished. Buell's body was shipped by train to his hometown, Zanesville, Ohio. Meadows, Rosalita. This was the daughter, probably born in 1900 after the June census, of Samuel and Minerva Dennis Meadows. Sam and Minerva were natives of Missouri and married in 1881 in what was then Umatilla County. Sam owned the telephone livery stable on Main Street. At the time of the 1900 census, they had two daughters, Lorena, 16, and Mary, 6, and two sons, Lester, who was 19, and Samuel W., 12. By 1910, Rosalita had been born and lost, and Mary had died in 1902. Morgan, Sarah Sailing Morgan and her son Robert Sailing Morgan, his wife Pearl Wells Morgan, and their baby. Sarah Morgan was a widow, almost 50, and the mother of 10 children. She and Samuel N. Morgan homesteaded near Sand Hollow, 10 miles northeast of Heppner, operating a dairy and growing vegetables and berries and raising chickens, horses, and cattle. They drove into Heppner on Saturday mornings and delivered milk, buttermilk, eggs, and produce to individual customers and stores. After Samuel died in 1894, Sarah continued the operation with the help of her older children and hired men. In 1903, Sarah had 5 children in their 20s, including Robert, who would be 27 in 2 months, and 4 children still school age, Mary, 15, Will, 14, and twins, Harrison and Helen, 12. Robert and Pearl, who was almost 22, lived across Chase Street from her parents, Abe and Betty Wells. They had married in Heppner the previous July and had a new baby. The oldest surviving Morgan children, 25-year-old Milton and 23-year-old Artemisia, took charge of their brothers and sisters. Artie moved the 4 youngest into Heppner, where they finished school. The Sand Hollow acreage was sold. See Sailing Wells. Olson, John D. This man was a sheep shearer and herder. His luggage was never claimed. Oxley, J. Frank and his son. Frank was manager of Oscar Miner's stock farm a mile north of Heppner and lived there with his wife Margaret, 34, and their 10-month-old son, also named Frank. On June 14th, the elder Frank had gone to the barn to get milk. Suddenly seeing the wave approach, he ran back. Margaret and the baby were upstairs. Margaret Oxley told the Oregon Journal that just as Frank reached their house, the flood swamped him and swept up the house. She was holding the baby, but when the house hit a huge log and disintegrated, he was torn from her arms. Margaret survived by riding a piece of debris until it lodged on a bank downstream. Padberg, Sarah. This 61-year-old woman was the widow of Daniel Jane when she married Henry Padberg, a well-to-do rancher on Rhea Creek south of Heppner, in 1895. Sarah had been born in Illinois, the daughter of Daniel and Isabella Hathaway. Sarah and Daniel Jane had 6 children, adults at the time of the flood, except for 14-year-old Harry. Sarah had helped rear Daniel Jane's son, Charles. Sarah had filed for divorce from Henry Padberg in 1900 after 5 years of marriage. She was buried next to Daniel Jane in Heppner Masonic Cemetery. Paul, Bessie. The 6-year-old daughter of Catherine Paul Walton was born May 8, 1897. Her father had died before she was 3 years old. She and her widowed mother were living with Bessie's grandparents in Grant County, the next county south of Heppner, in June 1900. Katie Paul married William Willie Walton 19 days before the flood, and they had moved into a house on Heppner's Main Street near Willow Creek. Bessie is buried with her mother and stepfather in Heppner Masonic Cemetery. See Walton. Peterson, Andrew M. This salesman's home was in Hillsboro, Oregon, and he was in Heppner taking orders for Pacific Woolen Mills, staying at the Heppner Hotel. Peterson, Charles, identified as a traveling man from Chicago. He was presumed to be staying at the Heppner Hotel. Potter, Joe. Some descendants of Joseph H. Potter's family believe he died in the Heppner Flood. Born in December 1866, he was one of 4 brothers in Sherman County who emigrated from Portugal in 1873. He was 36 years old in 1903 and disappeared from his family before World War I. The family thinks he was a traveling salesman for a jewelry company, probably staying in the Heppner Hotel after taking the train there June 13th or 14th from his home in Wasco, about 50 miles northwest of Heppner. He could have been planning to call on Heppner merchants Monday morning. Another Joe Potter was feared lost until he and his wife came into Heppner from their home on Balm Fork the Saturday after the flood. Redfield, Belle and her daughter Blanche. Belle Horton Redfield was 31, the wife of Heppner attorney Charles E. Redfield. Blanche was 12. All 3 Redfields had been born in New York, and they had lived in Pendleton before moving to Heppner 7 years before the flood. On June 14th, Charles was in Portland. Blanche had been visiting 2 blocks away at the home of Cora and Gilbert Phelps, but ran home to be with her mother when the storm got frightening. When he got back to Heppner, Charles found not a trace of their home. Searchers found a book downstream inscribed to Blanche. Charles remarried in 1906, but died of blood poisoning 2 years later when he was 45. Rhea, Leonora and her daughter Lois Estes and an unborn child. Lenora, 41, was an accomplished milliner who had moved into a new ladies' hat shop 3 months before the flood. Leonora was the second wife of Rhea Creek pioneer and stockman Columbus A. Lum Rhea, who had 7,000 acres and large herds of cattle and sheep when he launched the First National Bank of Heppner. Leonora was born in California on October 18, 1861, and had first married Logan J. Estes, a physician who had practiced in Baker, Oregon, and died in February 1899. Their one child, Loie, was 7 years old in 1903. Lum had 8 children with Emma Sophronia Adkins before she died in May 1900. It appears Leonora and Lum were married in 1902. On June 14th, Lum was in Portland. Leonora and Loie were home with Lum's daughter, Ada Curtis, and his granddaughter, Lori Marie and Nora Adkins, niece of the late Sophronia Rhea. Leonora and Ada were both expecting babies soon. Whatever the floodwaters did to Leonora's stock of hats and hat-making supplies, a note advertising bargains on both ran in the Gazette for weeks after the flood. See Atkins, Curtis, Estes. Roberts, James and Stella and their son Ora. James J. Roberts was 46, born in California, and had been in Morrow County for at least 10 years. The Gazette reported he volunteered in Tiger Cart, the first fire company organized in Heppner in January 1893. James was a building contractor and probably clerk for the Heppner School District. He had been in the hospital in Portland for some time, but had returned, according to the Gazette, March 12, 1903, much improved in health. His wife, Stella Simmons Roberts, was 37. Their son, Ora L., was 15. James and Stella belonged to 2 lodges each and lived, unfortunately, on Main Street. James's mother, Mrs. A. Roberts of Cedarville, California, sent a box of flowers for their graves that caused the Gazette to take note on July 23, 1903. The Roberts' other son, John, 17, escaped the flood and went to live with his maternal grandfather, John R. Simmons, in Portland. John married a woman from Waitsburg, Washington, and died in July 1915. Rude. Lutetia and her daughter, Lutetia, or Tecia. Lutetia was 48, married to Edward D. Rude, who, with his twin brother Andrew, were successful sheep ranchers near 8 Mile. The Rude brothers emigrated with their father from Norway in 1850 after their mother died. They were 11 years old and living in Wisconsin when their father died 4 years later. The twins fought with the Union Army in the Civil War before settling in Morrow County in 1873. Edward and Lutetia were living in North Heppner with their only child, 5-year-old Tecia, on June 14th. When the water subsided, Ed could hear his wife calling from under a pile of rubble and tried to summon men to extricate her. By the time workers were able to reach her 3 days later, Lutetia had died. Sailing. William Lee and Martha Stroud Sailing. They had married on May 15, 1902, just over a year before the flood. Bill Sailing was 2 weeks from turning 37. He formerly was county superintendent of schools, and in June 1903 had been Morrow County assessor for 18 months. He had also been president of Sailing Abstract and Title Guarantee Company. Their home was a 3-block walk from his office in the Morrow County Courthouse, an issue for a man whose right leg had been crippled by a runaway horse when he was 10. 15 years to the day earlier, Bill's home had been destroyed by a cyclone that struck Lexington June 14, 1888. He was president and solo cornetist of the Heppner Symphony Band and half-brother of flood victim Sarah Sailing Morgan. Maddie was 29, born January 10, 1874. She had lived in the Dalles with her widowed mother, Margaret, a dressmaker, and described herself for the 1900 census as a dry goods clerk. Their mothers, Margaret Stroud and Artemisia Sailing, survived. Maddie's body was found still wearing the ring Bill commissioned for her, set with a garnet he found near Sumter, Oregon. See Morgan. Stalter. Samantha Hart and 6 of her children, Louis, Robbie, Leah, Fern, Amy, and Anna. Dan Stalter and their 9-year-old daughter, Mary Elizabeth, were among the handful of people swept into the floodwaters who came out alive. But at the Heppner Masonic Cemetery, etched granite reveals the weight of their loss. Samantha N. Hart, wife of D.B. Stalter, born September 5, 1868, died June 14, 1903. Louis, born June 1, 1890. Robbie, born April 3, 1892. Leah, born February 4, 1895. Fern May, born May 26, 1897. Amy, born March 4, 1899. Anna, born March 24, 1901. Daniel B. Stalter and Samantha Hart, daughter of Ransom and Eudora Hart, were married December 20th, 1887 in Heppner. They had developed a farm and stock ranch of 1,200 acres south of town, raising especially horses. He had emigrated from Germany at 18, living in the East and Idaho before he got to Morrow County. On June 14th, she was 34, he was 47. They were in their townhome on Gale Street, 2 lots north of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Their house was torn in 2. Dan got on some driftwood and was pulling Samantha aboard when a wave washed them under. When Dan came up, Lizzie was hanging to his neck. Samantha and the other children were gone. He managed to grab a box from the debris and they crawled in, riding it for 3 miles until it lodged against other debris and they escaped. Dan had launched a mining concern in the Greenhorn Mountains near Sumter 2 years before the flood. After the catastrophe, friends supported him by forming the Heppner Mining Company. He was president and majority stockholder the rest of his life. Working alone with pick and shovel, Dan got minerals from the property, but it was never a commercial success. Samantha's sister, Amy Day, reared Lizzie in Heppner and Portland while Dan worked the mines. In spite of losing his wife and 6 children, Dan was known as a jolly person, a man who could be counted on to bring his friends a gallon of homebrew when he came back to Heppner every winter from the mines. Dan died in Portland June 20th, 1936, 33 years after the Heppner Flood. He was survived by Mary Elizabeth Lynn of Portland. See Hart. Stein, John. This 36-year-old Portland banker was a native of Holland in Heppner because he and others were preparing to buy Columbus Reyes First National Bank of Heppner, or perhaps to start a second bank. John was born in Amsterdam, February 25, 1866, to a German father and Dutch mother. He immigrated to Logan, Utah in 1888, and Altjen Kodewin, who would become his wife, immigrated the next year when her father, an official of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was recruited to Salt Lake City. John and Altjen were married November 2, 1892, and later moved to Portland. In 1900, he listed his occupation as bookkeeper. They had 6 children: Kate, Gerard, William, Willie, John, Maria, Cornelius Robert, and Paul. John had been staying at the Heppner Hotel for 3 months. His family was in Portland waiting to join him in Heppner. Family photos and a letter John received from Willie are on display in the Morrow County Museum. Altjen remained in the Portland area. Their youngest, Paul, died in 1904. Tharp, Jonathan P. This is likely the 40-year-old Virginia native from Piper's Gap, a single man apparently supporting his widowed mother, Matilda, who was 70 in June 1900. J.P. Tharp was a sheep herder in Heppner June 14th, presumed dead because his luggage was not claimed. The 1900 census says he was one of Matilda's 6 children, 5 of whom were still living. His occupation, farming. Thornton, George R., Ava, and their daughter Doris. George, 40, was born October 4th, 1862 in Wisconsin and was county roadmaster. He had been county surveyor and Heppner town marshal and was famous for working hard, but always spending Sundays at home with Ava and their 3 children. Ava Smith Thornton was 35, born February 12, 1868, to the late Harvey Smith and Eliza Greenwood Smith, who now was married to Thomas W. Ayers. George and Ava were married in Heppner October 1st, 1891. Their youngest, Doris, was 6. The family lived along Willow Creek, along the other Ayers family homes. The 2 Thornton sons, Raymond 10 and Greenwood 8, were at the home of Mrs. W.P. Scrivener and were not hurt. Turner, Albert, a sheep shearer from Charlton, Iowa. He was registered at the Heppner Hotel and was presumed dead because he did not return for his luggage. Vaughn, Benjamin F. and Nancy Jane. Benjamin, nearly 49 and a dentist, was Heppner's postmaster. He was born August 4th, 1854, in Oregon. B.F. and Nanny Bryans Vaughn, 47, had been married 9 years earlier, after both were widowed. Nancy was born in California August 6th, 1855. Her first husband, George W. Bryans, who farmed near 8 Mile, died in 1890. They had 7 children, including one who died when a toddler, the others now grown. Benjamin was one of 11 children of Henry J. Vaughn and Elizabeth Sampson Vaughn. He had 3 adult children. The flood found Benjamin and Nanny at home on Court Street. The Vaughns' bodies were uncovered June 16th, locked in an embrace. Walton, William E. and Catherine, and her daughter, Bessie Paul. William Elmer Walton, 24, and Katie Paul Walton, 23, were married 7 weeks before the flood on April 25, 1903, in Heppner First Christian Church. Katie was born August 26, 1879. Her first husband had died more than 3 years earlier, and she and Bessie had lived for a time with Katie's parents in Grant County, where the Walton family raised cattle. A month after their wedding, Katie was scheduled to show final proof on a 160-acre homestead in Morrow County. Willie, born April 15, 1879, was the 5th of the 8 children of William W. and Elizabeth Bowman Walton. See Paul. Wells, Abraham S. and Betty Yoakum Wells, their sons George and Harry, daughter-in-law Myrtle, and infant grandchild. Abe and Betty's daughter, Pearl Wells Morgan, and her husband and new baby died across the street. Abe, born April 18, 1842 in Arkansas, was 61 and had been one of the first settlers on Rhea Creek, arriving in 1858. He and Betty Yoakum Wells, 49, had been married 33 years and had 12 children, though they had buried twins born in 1879. George Wells was 30, engaged in real estate and home supply businesses. He and his wife Jenny had a home several blocks south of his parents, but George was spending the afternoon with Abe and Betty and the others. Jenny had gone to visit in Walla Walla the week before, carrying their child, Clarence Caton Wells, who wasn't yet a year old. Harry Wells was 14. Myrtle Cutlack Wells, wife of Daniel Clyde Wells, was 24. I presume the infant counted in the family toll was Daniel and Myrtle's. On June 14th, 8 members of the Wells family were watching the storm on porches around the big family home on Chase. When they saw the wall of water coming, all rushed inside. Son Glenn would later recount to the East Oregonian, Abe took some to one part of the house while George and Glenn worked to get Betty, who took a fall that afternoon, upstairs. The house was torn in 2. One part with the father and part of the family floating one way, and the other with the 2 boys and the mother going the other. George, Glenn, and Betty got on a remnant of the house. They were calm and for a time thought that they would come out all right. Another piece lodged against theirs, and George and Glenn were preparing to lift Betty to the bigger raft when a large timber shot over the edge of the float and struck George in the forehead, knocking him off into the water. Then the platform tore in 2, and Betty was hurled between the 2 pieces and never rose to the surface again. Glenn floated another quarter mile until his raft ran up on the bank and he crawled away, the only survivor of his family's supper-time gathering. The paper finished. The Wells house was a large square building having a cement cellar and a stone-lined well. The force of the water completely washed the cement out of the cellar, leaving nothing but the excavation. It also took every rock out of the wall of the well and left it nothing but a hole in the ground. See Morgan. Willis, Eliza M., her son James A., and 2 of James's sons, Frank and Fred. Minnie Willis, wife of James and mother of Frank, Fred, and 1-year-old Harlan, died 2 years later of flood injuries. Eliza, 58, born September 18, 1844, was the widow of J. Franklin Willis, Morrow County Assessor, for 2 terms when the family lived in Lexington. James, born May 2, 1873, was 30. He was the youngest of Eliza's children, born after the family, including 4 sons born in Iowa, arrived in Oregon at the end of a journey by covered wagon. James, Minnie, and their 3 boys were neighbors of Eliza, who also was providing a home for Gertrude Ford, who had been placed with her by the Boys and Girls Aid Society of Portland. On June 14th, Frank, born October 29th, 1894, was 8, and Frederick, born September 26th, 1896, was 6. All who died June 14th, including Gertrude Ford, were buried in Heppner Masonic Cemetery. See Ford. According to Lade Family Research, Minnie Myrtle Lade Willis and baby Harlan improved enough to go to Troy, Idaho to live with her parents, Cyrus and Elizabeth Lade, who had lived in Morrow County in the early 1890s. Minnie had been born September 20th, 1875. She and James had been married January 9th, 1894 in Morrow County. Minnie died at her parents' home, apparently of her injuries, on May 26, 1905. She is buried in Spencer Cemetery off Highway 8 outside Troy. Census records trace Harlan and his lead grandparents to Portland in 1910 and Harlan to Lewis County in Washington State in 1920. Woodward, Clara Hale. Clara, formerly Clarinda, was 43, one of the 12 children of Michael Hale and Nancy Smith Hale. She married John Woodward in March 1877, and they ranched near Butter Creek, 16 miles east of Heppner, raising cattle, horses, and sheep. Clara and John had 8 children, but before the flood, they buried a newborn on January 7, 1890, and a youngster who died of diphtheria 3 weeks later. 3 other children, Mac, James, and Nina, are sometimes listed as victims of the flood, but an illustrated history of Umatilla County and of Morrow County, published in 1902, reported that they had already died. There are no dates on their headstones, which are small matching hearts that suggest the children died at the same time. Clara had to endure the deaths of 2 children, or more likely 5. She was survived by only 3 of her 8 children, Francis, Charles, and Chauncey. John remarried and had 4 more children with Ada Kilcup, losing 1 in infancy. Charles died in 1923, Chauncey in 1925, and John's second wife, Ada, in 1934. When John died in 1937, he had buried 8 children and 2 wives. He still had Francis from his marriage to Clara and sons Bob, Harold, and Roy from his second family. Wright, L. Grover. Lafayette Grover Wright, according to a family story, had come to Heppner to file some paperwork at the Morrow County Courthouse, and since he didn't get finished, had registered at the Heppner Hotel for the night. We don't know if he had taken up residence out in the country or was there visiting his brothers, Andrew and Sylvanus, both of whom lived in Morrow County in 1900. Grover was no stranger here. Both his parents lived and died in Morrow County. Grover Wright was 45, the 4th of 8 children of Lyndon Wright, a native of North Carolina, and Asenath Neal, who was born in Arkansas. He married Susan Brown, a young widow with 3 small children, when they wed in Salem in 1885. Grover and Susan had 5 children and were divorced about 1900. Grover's 5 children survived him. Wyland, James Stewart. This 14-year-old was spending the afternoon with his grandparents, Julius and Amanda Keithley. His grandmother, who was 60, also died, despite Julius's attempts to save her. James was the son of Leora Keithley Wyland, Julius's daughter from his first marriage, and James H. Wyland, Amanda's son from her marriage to Andrew J. Wyland. Amanda and Julius had been married in 1884, the same year their children were wed. See Keithley. Chinese victims. 7 of Heppner's 12 Chinese residents died in the Heppner Flood. Most Chinese people in the region in 1903 came from Guangdong province, which surrounds Hong Kong on the South China Sea. Chinese author Marie Rose Wong wrote in Sweet Cake's Long Journey that in the mid-1880s, 28 million people lived in Guangdong province, and a substantial population needing to be fed and limited resources with which to do so meant that it was almost impossible to avoid starvation. These people brought their keen knowledge of agriculture to America, but worked as manual laborers and domestics as well as farmhands. It is probable that the Chinese men in eastern Oregon entered the U.S. at Astoria, Oregon, where Oregon's first U.S. Customs Office had opened in 1848, and likely they worked for the railroads. They may have been among the 900 Chinese men who mined on Canyon Creek, a tributary of the John Day River 72 miles southeast of Heppner, where gold was discovered in 1862. Chances are that all the men in Heppner were from the same district of China. Stephen Gillespie, who translated the stones remaining in the Heppner Masonic Cemetery, wrote to the Heppner.net webmaster, "It isn't very likely that in the small town of Heppner there would have been enough Chinese people to have supported two different subgroups speaking different dialects of Chinese. The men in Heppner worked at the two Chinese restaurants, or ran laundries, or did other work around town. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 must have made it nearly impossible for their wives and families to join them. They were known by American nicknames, usually preceded by Chinese or Chinese, and those are the only names we have for three Chinese men presumed killed by the Heppner Flood: Chinese Charlie, Chinese Len, and Chinese Sullivan. Chinese Sullivan was a wood sawyer, described by Art Crawford of the Gazette-Times family as a small, wiry-type man with a good sense of humor. He seemed to give something more than his labor at all times. Two Chinese victims are still buried in Heppner Masonic Cemetery, and when Gillespie translated their marble headstones, he reported they apparently came from the Hsining, now Taishan, district of Guangdong province. Hua Eng was born in Tangmian, a village in the Hsining region. Suen Lui was from Namagong, a village apparently now a part of the town of Haiyan. The two others were buried in Lone Fir Cemetery in Portland. Mak Fu, also known as Ah Mak, was 40. His brother, Mak Gong, according to the estate records commonly known as Chinese George, may also have lived in Oregon. The Oregon Journal reported Mak Fu's funeral was marked by much pomp and ceremony. Ung Ching Hing was Mak Fu's partner in a laundry on the banks of Willow Creek. It is likely that the remains of all the men except Hua Eng and Suen Lui were returned to China. The three temporarily buried in Heppner were repatriated in 1928. Typhoid deaths. A number of people died of typhoid fever the autumn after the Heppner flood. They were lost because floodwaters had contaminated shallow wells downstream from Heppner in the areas of Lexington and Ione. Fawcett, Ellen. This child was 12 years old, and when she died on September 16, 1903, she had already had enough hard knocks to last a much longer lifetime. Mary Ellen was born in February 1892 in Athena, the youngest daughter of Zebulon Pike Fawcett and Laura Fine Fawcett. Her mother had married Zebulon in December 1884 when she was a widow with 4 sons, and he had a 280-acre farm near Weston, Oregon. Laura and Zebulon had 5 children, including Susan Laura, who would become a hero, and a son named for his father, who was disabled in childhood. The children's father died in the early 1890s, and in 1896, Laura married the Fawcett's ranch hand and moved with him and her children to Edwall in Lincoln County, Washington. Things got more difficult 3 years into the marriage after Laura died on October 5, 1899. Her husband, Frank Slater, sent his stepson, the crippled Zebby, to the poor farm. Susan, then 16 years old, got Zebby from the facility and went to work southeast of Harrington, supporting herself and him. The boy died in April 1906, soon after Susan married. In 1901, Frank remarried and became responsible for another set of stepchildren, which may have triggered Ellen's move to Lexington. Two of Ellen's half-brothers, the offspring of her mother's first marriage, lived in Lexington. In 1901 and 1902, William and George Broadley had married sisters Minnie and Lou McMillan, daughters of a large Lexington ranching family, and settled there. One of the Broadley couples apparently made a home for Ellen and perhaps for her sister Sarah. Ellen died in Lexington. Fleming, Edward H. Fleming was 27 years old when he died on November 16, 1903. He had been born May 20th, 1876 in Texas, the youngest of 6 children of William J. Fleming and E.C. Carpenter. His parents are buried in Hardman, Oregon. Edward had married Rosa Myrtle Cox of Lexington on November 9, 1898. The 1900 census lists Edward and his brother Robert as farmers in Ione. Family records say Edward died in Lexington. Rosa was 22 when he died. Their daughter Opal was 4, and their son Arthur was 3. Hagewood, William. This victim, who farmed near 8 Mile, died in November 1903. His funeral was November 19th in Ione. He had been married almost 18 years to Mary Warfield, a sister of Samuel N. Warfield. S.N. Warfield had died of typhoid with his wife and daughter the month before. Ingraham, Charles W. This man was 34 when he died in Ione on November 14th, 1903. His wife, Alma Blake Ingraham, had died 9 months earlier on February 2nd, 1903, 3 months before her 20th birthday. Charles and Alma are buried in Ione's Highview Cemetery next to their son, John H.M. Ingraham, who lived but 1 day in December 1901. Warfield, Samuel N., Sarah, and their daughter Olga. The Warfield family had been farming near Ione for decades before the Heppner Flood. Sam Warfield was a famous fighter in the Indian Wars in the 1880s and had died 4+ months before the flood. Samuel N. was Samuel's son, born February 3, 1860, and in 1903 was 43 years old. Sarah Simpson Warfield, young Samuel's wife, was born September 14, 1870, and was 32. They had been married March 17, 1889. Olga was their 4-year-old, born August 4, 1899. The family had a farm outside Ione and a house in town, and we don't know where they became ill. Samuel N. was the first to die on October 13th. Sarah died 4 days later, October 17th. Olga was lost 2 days after her mother on October 19th. 5 children were orphaned. Robert, 13, Chester, 12, James, 10, Lovely, 7, and little Samuel N., age 1. In his last official act, Morrow County Judge Alba G. Bartholomew appointed Wesley T. McNabb, also an Ione farmer, guardian for the surviving children. Corrections to Calamity, the Heppner Flood of 1903 by Joann Green Byrd. In the acknowledgments and introduction, page 9, line 29, and page 16, line 14, the title of Mark Heiberger's book is Days of Sorrow. In chapter 1, page 6, line 34. The company name is Fairbanks Morse and Company. Map 3, June 14th, 1903, 5:20 to 6:30 p.m., page 20. Victims, number 22 was James Matlock. Brother Tom survived. Chapter 3, page 24, line 20. William M. Ayers was Alfred L. Ayers's and John Luther Ayers's first cousin. Gallery of photos following page 78. 15th page. Heppner looking east in about 1901, line 3. The light-colored buildings at the center are the Oddfellows building with windows, and just to its right, the Roberts building. In Remembrance, the Victims, page 115, lines 7 and 8. Bessie, Winnie, and Lyndon were grandchildren of Alfred A. Ayers, grandnieces and grandnephew of Alfred A.'s brothers, T.W. and William Ayers. Their mother was Annabelle. Page 116, line 18. We do not know who J.W. Brady's parents were. Page 125, line 1. James Long was Rebecca Howard's nephew. Page 129, line 26. James and Mina Long had 9 children. Page 130, line 2. Rebecca Howard was James Long's aunt. Page 130, line 4 through 7. James and Mina Long's daughter Amy was buried near Freezeout Ridge before they moved into Heppner. From the index, page 186, line 21, William M. Ayers was the son of Alfred A. Ayers, whose brothers were Thomas W. and William Ayers. Notes. In the first printing, page 167, note 44, the last sentence should be, "It inspired the title." Names. In the first printing, Stephanie Simmons's first name is misspelled on pages XIII, 147, and 181. Stephen Thompson's first name is misspelled on pages 90 and 200. All right. Well, I'd like to thank you for listening to Joann Green Byrd's Calamity, the Heppner Flood of 1903. It's been a pleasure to put this audiobook together. For anyone desiring to own a copy of the book, I've left some links in the description box below for several online outlets where it can be purchased. If you appreciated this narrated effort, feel free to give it a like by clicking the thumbs up icon. That should in turn help with the YouTube algorithm promoting this video far and wide. Thanks again, and have a great one.